The CEO of Helios AI, a platform that aggregates billions of data points to provide a real-time view of climate and economic risks affecting commodities around the globe, said in an interview with the Packer that we are at the beginning of the worst food crisis we have ever seen, with global food prices heading 12 to 18% higher by the end of the year. And he said something that I want you to remember for the rest of this video, because it is the single most important sentence in the entire American food conversation right now. He said the fuse was lit in February and the harvest damage is already locked in. Locked in. That means it does not matter what happens with the war from this point forward. It does not matter if a ceasefire is signed tomorrow. It does not matter if the Strait of Hormuz reopens next week. The fertilizer that was not applied this spring cannot be retroactively applied in July. The crops that were planted with insufficient nitrogen will produce lower yields. The corn acreage that was switched to soybeans because farmers could not afford the fertilizer for corn will not produce the corn that was needed for feed, for ethanol, for the thousands of products that depend on it. And the UN World Food Programme predicts an additional 45 million people worldwide could face food insecurity by the end of 2026 if the disruption continues. 45 million people, on top of the 300 million who already do not have enough to eat. And the American consumer, who thinks this is a problem happening somewhere else, needs to understand that food prices are global. What happens to wheat yields in Australia and corn yields in Iowa and rice yields in India does not stay in those countries. It flows through commodity markets, through futures prices, through wholesale costs, through distribution networks, and lands on your grocery shelf at a price that reflects every disruption in the chain. And the chain just broke in the most critical place at the most critical time. And what I am going to show you in this video is exactly how America, the country that led the world in creating the modern food system, the country that has been the world's top food exporter for decades, is about to discover what happens when it cannot feed itself at a price its own people can afford. The fertilizer pipeline is broken, and there is no fix that arrives before the fall harvest. 50% of all globally traded urea transits through the Strait of Hormuz. Qatar Fertiliser Company, the world's largest urea production site, is currently offline. Spring planting in the Northern Hemisphere is underway right now without full access to the fertilizer that determines whether the crops being planted will produce food at yields sufficient to feed the population. And this is not a shortage that can be fixed with a phone call or a policy announcement. The strait has been functionally closed for over 5 weeks. Tanker traffic collapsed by over 90% following the initial strikes on maritime infrastructure. And urea prices have surged to $650 per ton, a 30% increase in a matter of weeks, according to Financial Contents Analysis. Goldman Sachs reports nitrogen fertilizer prices up approximately 40% since the conflict began, and the Fertilizer Institute estimates that U.S. farmers could face a shortfall of approximately 2 million tons of urea this spring. While the United States produces the majority of its nitrogen fertilizer domestically, roughly 18 to 20% is imported, and that gap is now nearly impossible to fill because the same shortages affecting the U.S. are affecting every other country simultaneously. You cannot import from a source that does not have enough for itself. And the American Farm Bureau Federation said we are going on to year 4 of losses across the farm economy, and it is going to become harder and harder for them to put a crop in the ground. An AFBF economist named Faith Parham said farmers can still get the product right now, but it is really expensive, and they are starting to hear that the longer this goes on, they will also have issues with even the availability of the fertilizer. Not just the price, the availability. And the response from American farmers has been exactly what agricultural economists predicted. They are switching crops. Corn acreage intentions dropped to 95.3 million acres, a 3.5% decrease, as farmers pivot to soybeans, which require less nitrogen fertilizer. That decision, made on thousands of farms across the Corn Belt in March and April 2020, will determine what America harvests in September and October. And a smaller corn harvest means higher corn prices, which means higher feed costs for cattle, poultry, and hog operations, which means higher meat prices at the grocery store, which means higher food costs for every family in the country. And the cascade does not stop at meat. Corn is in everything. High fructose corn syrup, ethanol, which is blended into gasoline, cornstarch, corn oil, animal feed for the dairy industry that produces your milk, cheese, butter, and yogurt. And Francisco Martin Rayo of Helios AI said fertilizer not applied in April cannot be retroactively applied in July. The strait will reopen, but the food system clock does not reset when it does. The fuse was lit in February. The harvest damage is already locked in. That is the timeline. It is not a prediction. It is agricultural biology. The crops are in the ground. The fertilizer was insufficient. The yields are determined. And the prices that result from those reduced yields will arrive at your grocery store this fall. There is nothing that can be done to change that outcome. It is already decided. It was decided in March and April on farms across the Northern Hemisphere, when farmers looked at the cost of fertilizer and the uncertainty of supply and made the only decision they could afford to make. And you are going to pay for that decision with every grocery trip from September forward. And here is the part that makes this crisis different from anything America has faced before. In previous food price spikes, the United States could rely on its domestic production capacity and its position as the world's largest food exporter to buffer its population from the worst effects. But this time, the disruption is not limited to one country or one commodity. It is hitting every major agricultural input simultaneously across every producing region on the planet. The same fertilizer shortage that is affecting Iowa is affecting Brazil, India, Australia, and East Africa. The same diesel increase that is raising costs for American truckers is raising costs for grain transport in Argentina and Ukraine. And the same closed strait that is blocking urea from reaching American ports is blocking it from reaching every other port in the world, which means the global food supply is being reduced everywhere at the same time. And when the global supply contracts, countries compete for what remains. And the competition is where the danger escalates from a price problem to an availability problem. Martin Rayo warned that the futures markets are currently pricing in a price shock, but they are not pricing in an availability or export restriction shock, and that is a huge difference. When major producing nations decide to restrict exports to protect their own populations, which is exactly what happened in 2022, when India banned wheat exports and Indonesia banned palm oil exports, the market does not just get more expensive, it gets empty. And that is the scenario that nobody in the American food conversation wants to contemplate. Not that food gets expensive, that food gets scarce. The American farmer is in the worst financial crisis in a generation, and the people who grow your food are going bankrupt. Time magazine published an investigation titled, "U.S. Farmers Are in Crisis," and the headline barely captures the severity of what is happening to the people who grow the food that keeps this country alive. Farm bankruptcies surged 46% between 24 and 25, reaching 315 Chapter 12 filings, the highest level in years. And farm sector debt was projected to hit a record $624.7 billion in 2026, even before the war started. That is $624.7 billion in debt, carried by an industry that is now entering its fourth consecutive year of losses. 4 years of losses in the industry that feeds 330 million people. And a coalition of 56 agricultural organizations sent a letter to Congress on January 15th, calling for immediate action and warning that extreme economic pressures are threatening the long-term viability of the U.S. agriculture sector. 56 organizations, representing farmers and ranchers across every state and every crop category in the country. And they used the phrase long-term viability, which in agricultural economics is as close to an emergency alarm as the industry gets. And Grist reported that the 43-day government shutdown froze financial assistance to farmers during the critical harvesting and crop planting season, creating potential risks to the U.S. food supply chain in 2026 and 2027. Without adequate financial assistance from the federal government, the nation's food is on track to become more expensive and more limited in supply. And the Farm Bill that is supposed to set national policy for agriculture, nutrition, and conservation has not been updated since 2023. Farmers are operating under rules written in 2017, before COVID, before the supply chain collapse, before the current inflation crisis, before the fertilizer shortage, and before the war. A policy director at the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition said farming is an inherently risky business, but what we have seen over the past 12-plus months is something different. And a farm worker advocate said the farmers she works with know what they are signing up for. They know it is hard work, they know they can barely break even, but there is only so many times you can take a hit and not fall apart. And that is the human story behind the economic data. These are not corporations, many of them are families. Multi-generational families who have farmed the same land for 50 or 80 or 100 years. And they are looking at diesel at $5.40, fertilizer at $650 per ton, interest rates on their operating loans at 7 to 8%, commodity prices that have been declining for years because of global oversupply, and a federal government that shut down for 43 days during planting season and cut the nutrition programs that create demand for their products. And they are asking the question that should terrify every American who eats food, which is every American, is it still worth it to farm? Because when enough of them answer no, when enough of them sell the land to a developer or a corporate conglomerate or simply walk away, the food that used to come from a family farm in Iowa comes from somewhere else. Or it does not come at all. And the average age of an American farmer is 58 years old. The next generation is not lining up to replace them, and you cannot rebuild a farming culture that has been abandoned. The knowledge, the soil management, the crop rotation expertise, the community infrastructure, the co-ops, the local markets, all of it disappears when the farmer disappears, and it does not come back. And here is a fact that most Americans are completely unaware of. The United States now imports more food than it exports by value. The country that was once the undisputed agricultural superpower of the world is now a net food importer. American farms have been quietly disappearing for decades. Productive farmland acreage has dropped. Consolidation has replaced family operations with corporate industrial farming that prioritizes efficiency over resilience. And the U.S. cattle herd is the smallest it has been in 75 years. The illusion of plenty that greets you every time you walk into a grocery store. The stacked shelves, the mountains of produce, the endless variety is maintained by a supply chain that is optimized for cost efficiency, not for crisis resilience. It works beautifully under normal conditions, and it fractures instantly under abnormal ones. The pandemic proved that when grocery shelves went empty, not because there was no food, but because the supply chain could not redirect from food service to retail fast enough. And the current crisis is not a redirection problem. It is a production problem. Less fertilizer means less yield. Less yield means less food. And no amount of supply chain optimization can solve a shortage of the food itself. The diesel-to-food pipeline means every dollar increase in fuel shows up in every product on every shelf, and there is no way around it. There is a fundamental truth about the American food system that most consumers do not understand because they never had to think about it until now. Every single calorie that arrives on your plate traveled there on diesel. The tractor that tilled the soil runs on diesel. The planter that put the seeds in the ground runs on diesel. The sprayer that applied the pesticides and herbicides runs on diesel. The combine that harvested the crop runs on diesel. The truck that carried the grain from the farm to the elevator runs on diesel. The train that moved it from the elevator to the processing plant runs on diesel. The truck that delivered the processed product to the distribution center runs on diesel. The refrigerated truck that carried it from the distribution center to your grocery store runs on diesel. And diesel went from $3.89 to $5.38 in less than a month, a 41% increase. And a supply chain expert at E2 Open told Food Navigator USA that fuel makes up roughly 30% of transportation costs. That near 50% increase in oil could translate to a 10 to 15% increase in transportation costs for food. And that increase applies to every mile of every trip of every product in the American food system simultaneously. NBC News reported that consumers may see higher prices sooner rather than later because of higher transport costs with pricier diesel. And Fortune magazine published an analysis titled "A Global Food Emergency: Why the Closed Strait of Hormuz Puts Half the World's Calories at Risk." They noted that even when crops are bountiful in the United States, consumers are not immune to global economic forces. A smaller 2026 crop with rising demand for livestock feed in the most populous countries will put pressure on global corn prices, affecting everyone regardless of nationality. And here is the part that connects the diesel price to your dinner table in a way that you can measure. The USDA projected a 3.1% average increase for all food prices in 2026. That projection was made using data from before the war, before diesel went up 41%, before fertilizer went up 40%, before the strait closed, before the IEA called it the largest supply disruption in history. The actual increase will be significantly higher. Helios AI projects 12 to 18% by year-end. And agricultural economists at Food Navigator say fresh foods will be hit first with a lag of around 2 to 3 months, meaning you will start seeing the price impact at the grocery store by late May or June. But the processed food and animal protein categories, where the diesel and fertilizer costs have to work through multiple layers of the supply chain, will not show up until the fall. By September and October, the full weight of the spring fertilizer crisis and the diesel surge will have arrived at every checkout counter in America. And John Lash, the supply chain expert, said food manufacturers have already pulled most price management levers to offset pandemic and tariff-related increases. They have already shrunk packages, they have already reformulated with cheaper ingredients, they have already reduced promotions. There is nothing left to absorb. The next increase goes straight to the consumer, and affordability is already a huge issue for people. They are still bruised from food prices going up during the pandemic, and companies are really reticent to increase prices again. But they will have no choice. Because the diesel cost is embedded in every mile of the supply chain, and the fertilizer cost is embedded in every bushel of grain, and neither of those costs can be avoided by switching to a cheaper brand or buying the store label. Every brand on the shelf traveled the same roads in trucks that burn the same diesel. The cost is universal, and it is coming. The safety net that was supposed to catch hungry families is being cut at the exact moment it is needed most. 42 million Americans rely on SNAP to put food on the table, and the program that feeds them is being cut, restructured, and subjected to new requirements that will push millions of eligible people off the rolls at the exact moment food prices are surging. The CBO projects that 2.4 million people will lose access to monthly food assistance under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. New work requirements demand 80 hours per month of documented employment or community service. New verification requirements for shelter and utility costs add paperwork hurdles that many low-income households will fail to meet, not because they are ineligible, but because they cannot navigate the administrative burden. And an agricultural economist at Ohio State University who specializes in food security said the shutdown exposed vulnerabilities throughout the nation's supply chain that could shift consumer behavior. And another expert said when SNAP shrinks, the whole food economy shrinks, and it does not just affect households who receive SNAP, it affects every household. Because SNAP money flows directly into grocery stores. $80 billion a year in SNAP benefits is spent at grocery stores, farmers markets, and food retailers. When that spending is reduced by 2.4 million participants, the stores that depend on it lose revenue. The farmers who supply those stores lose customers. And the communities where those stores and farms operate lose economic activity. And the food banks that are supposed to catch the people who fall out of SNAP are already overwhelmed. Feeding America has reported that demand at food banks has roughly doubled compared to pre-pandemic levels. And the donations that food banks rely on are declining because manufacturers find it more profitable to redirect surplus product overseas or convert it to animal feed than to donate it domestically. And an expert who works with food banks and local governments said the administration is moving massive amounts of demand back to the private sector and local government sector to fill in the gap, and that is impossible. And the Trump administration eliminated the nation's primary tool for tracking the fallout on food access before the shutdown even began. Which means that as millions of people lose food assistance and food prices surge simultaneously, the government has deliberately blinded itself to the consequences of its own policies. We will not know how many people are going hungry because the tool that would have told us was removed, and the children in those households are the ones who will pay the highest price. A child who does not eat enough does not just feel hungry. Their brain development slows, their cognitive function declines, their school performance drops, their immune system weakens, and the damage done by childhood malnutrition during critical developmental windows is not reversible with a meal next month or a policy change next year. It is permanent. Neural pathways that do not form during critical periods do not form later, and there are 13 million children in food-insecure households right now, and the programs that feed them are being cut while the food that remains is getting more expensive. That is the intersection point. More hunger, less help, higher prices, fewer options, and the people at the center of that intersection are the smallest, most vulnerable, and most voiceless members of American society. The farm labor force is being deported while the crops need picking, and nobody has a plan to replace the workers who are gone. There is a dimension of the food crisis that is almost never discussed in the mainstream coverage because it crosses into immigration politics, and neither party wants to have an honest conversation about it. But the data does not care about politics, and the data says this. The American food system depends on immigrant labor. Approximately 73% of farm workers are foreign-born, according to the USDA's Farm Labor Survey. And the immigration crackdown is removing workers from the farm and food sectors at the exact moment those workers are needed most. Grist reported that the administration's immigration enforcement agenda is throttling the farm and food sectors with labor shortages that risk supply shortfalls and sticker shock. And the Roosevelt Institute noted that the significant effect of deportations on the construction industry, coupled with new tariffs on lumber, has pushed up the hard costs of building. The same dynamic is playing out in agriculture, but with higher stakes because you can delay building a house, but you cannot delay picking a crop. A tomato does not wait for labor policy to be resolved. It ripens, and if there is no one to pick it, it rots in the field. And the crops that rot in the field are crops that do not arrive at the grocery store. And Brookings estimated that reduced migration could raise prices by 1.5% over 3 years by creating scarcity in agriculture, food processing, and other labor-intensive sectors. And the irony is devastating. The same administration that is cutting food assistance for hungry Americans is simultaneously removing the workers who harvest the food that feeds those Americans. You are cutting demand and cutting supply at the same time. That is not a policy contradiction. That is a recipe for a food system that contracts from both ends until the people in the middle, the families at the grocery store, are squeezed between prices they cannot afford and shelves that are not fully stocked. And the produce sector will be hit first and hardest because fruits and vegetables cannot be harvested mechanically in most cases. They require human hands. Lettuce, strawberries, tomatoes, peppers, tree fruits. These crops are hand-picked by workers who are overwhelmingly immigrant labor. When those workers are removed from the fields, the crops go unharvested. They rot. The domestic supply of fresh produce contracts. The prices at the grocery store for fresh fruits and vegetables increase. And the families who are already choosing between processed food and fresh food because of cost are pushed even further toward the processed options that are 73% ultra-processed and that the FDA itself has linked to the chronic disease epidemic killing 678,000 Americans per year. The labor crisis feeds the food crisis, which feeds the health crisis. And nobody in Washington will say this out loud, because saying it requires acknowledging that the food system of the richest country on earth depends on the labor of people who are being treated as a threat rather than as the essential workforce they have always been. The United States cattle herd is the smallest it has been in 75 years. Let me say that again because most people have no idea. The number of cattle in America is at its lowest point since approximately 1951. And the reasons are a convergence of drought, rising feed costs, aging ranchers, consolidation in the meatpacking industry, and the simple mathematics of a business that has become unprofitable for many small and mid-size operators. Beef prices have already hit record highs. A fourth-generation cattle farmer in Georgia named Will Harris told NBC News he worries about how much more consumers will continue to pay for beef. And the feed costs are about to get worse because the corn that cattle eat is going to be more expensive this fall due to reduced acreage and reduced yields from the fertilizer crisis. And diesel costs for transporting cattle to processing plants have surged 41%. And the 4 companies that control 82% of U.S. beef slaughter, Tyson, JBS, Cargill, and National Beef, have the market power to squeeze both the rancher on one end and the consumer on the other. The rancher gets paid less, the consumer pays more. And the spread between what the rancher receives and what the consumer pays has widened to historic levels. And the consolidation means that when one processing plant has an issue, whether it is a labor shortage, an equipment failure, or a contamination event, there are very few alternatives. During COVID, meat processing plant shutdowns caused beef shelves to go empty in grocery stores, while ranchers were euthanizing cattle because they had no other buyer. That vulnerability has not been fixed. It has gotten worse because the herd is smaller, the plants are fewer, and the labor force is being reduced by immigration enforcement. And the families who will be most affected are the ones who rely on beef as a primary protein source, which disproportionately includes lower income and rural households. When beef becomes $9 or $10 a pound, those families do not just switch to chicken. Chicken is getting more expensive too, because chicken is fed corn and corn prices are rising. And pork is getting more expensive, because pork is fed corn. And eggs are getting more expensive, because laying hens are fed corn. The entire animal protein supply chain runs through corn, and corn is the crop that was most affected by the fertilizer crisis. Every protein at the grocery store is about to get more expensive simultaneously. And for a family that is already choosing between groceries and gas, the moment when a pound of ground beef costs what a gallon of gas used to cost is the moment when the American food system stops being something that feeds everyone and becomes something that feeds the people who can still afford it. The grocery bill that is coming this fall will redefine what American families can afford to eat, and the people who are not ready will be devastated. I want to put all of this together for you because I think most people are processing each piece of this crisis in isolation without seeing how they connect into a single devastating outcome. The fertilizer crisis reduced the inputs. The reduced inputs will produce lower yields. The lower yields will produce less food. The less food will produce higher prices. The higher diesel costs increase the transportation baseline for every product. The farm financial crisis is pushing farmers off the land. The labor force is being deported. The cattle herd is the smallest in 75 years. The corn acreage was cut because farmers could not afford the fertilizer. The safety net is being cut for 2.4 million SNAP recipients. The food banks are overwhelmed with double the pre-pandemic demand and declining donations. And the government eliminated the tool that would track how many people are going hungry. Every single one of those is happening simultaneously, not sequentially, simultaneously. And they all converge on the same place at the same time. Your grocery store. This fall, in September and October of 2026, the full impact of every decision made during this spring will arrive at the checkout counter. And the families that are prepared for it, the ones who stocked their pantries when the prices were lower, who built a cash reserve for the increase, who learned to cook from basic ingredients instead of depending on processed convenience foods, those families will absorb the shock. And the families that are not prepared, the ones who are living paycheck to paycheck, who have $600 in emergency savings, who are carrying $6,715 in credit card debt at 22% interest, who are spending 18.3% of their income on gas and have nothing left for a food price increase. Those families are going to face choices that no family in the richest country on earth should ever have to make, whether to feed the children or pay the electric bill, whether to fill a prescription or fill the refrigerator, whether to put gas in the car to get to work or put food on the table when they get home. And those choices will not be the result of a natural disaster or an unavoidable catastrophe. They will be the result of a war that disrupted a strait, a fertilizer shortage that reduced a yield, a diesel increase that raised a cost, a farm crisis that went unaddressed, a labor force that was deported, a safety net that was cut, and a government that chose not to see what was coming because seeing it would have required doing something about it. And they chose to do nothing. I am telling you this now, in April, because you still have time. Stock your pantry, buy the staples that keep rice, beans, oats, pasta, canned goods, cooking oil, peanut butter. Every dollar you spend on shelf-stable food in April is a dollar that will be worth 12 to 18% more than the same dollar in October. That is not speculation. That is the projection from the CEO of a company that tracks billions of agricultural data points for a living. Build your reserve now, not in panic, in preparation. Because the fall is coming. The prices are coming. The reduced yields are locked in. The harvest damage is already decided. And by the time you see it at the grocery store, it will be too late to prepare for it, because everyone else will be seeing it at the same time, and the shelves will empty the way they emptied in March 2020. Except this time, the supply chain on the other side of the empty shelf is producing less food, not more. Share this video with everyone who feeds a family, not for the algorithm, because the information in this video is the difference between a family that is ready and a family that is blindsided. And nobody deserves to be blindsided by a crisis that was visible 6 months in advance to anyone who was paying attention. Subscribe, turn on notifications. I am going to be tracking every indicator of this food crisis in real time. The fertilizer prices, the crop reports, the harvest projections, the grocery price data, the SNAP enrollment numbers, the food bank demand. All of it. No spin, no agenda, just the data and what it means for your family's table. Take care of yourselves out there. Feed your families well while you still can at these prices. Stock your pantry.